Jesus was an Aramaic-speaking Jew of the Middle East, and the Assyrians are Aramaic-speaking Christians in the Middle East who have endured persecution for over 1,000 years. Join Voice of the Word Aramaic Bible teacher, artist, and author Stephen Missick as he examines the Bible through the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times in which it was first revealed. Research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots. And now, Voice of the Word.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Andrew Missick, and in this program I want to discuss the Jewish roots of Aramaic Christianity. And we're going to look at the Syriac churches. Actually, the word Aram and Syria are synonyms, which that's what in Hebrew the word for Syria is Aram. So Aramaic actually means Syrian or Syriac. Actually, in the book of Daniel, the King James Version, it says, "And the wise men spoke to the king in Syriac." But Syriac is now used as a name of a particular dialect of Aramaic, and that is the dialect of Aramaic spoken in the city of Edessa, the center of Aramaic Christianity, called Syriac. And that's an ancient dialect, very similar to the Aramaic that Jesus spoke, and it's the official language of the Syriac or Aramaic churches. That would include the Maronite Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Assyrian Church of the East, Syrian Rite Catholic churches, and other Aramaic denominations. So what I want to look at is this book. This is called Christians in Asia Before 1500, Ian Gilman and Hans Joachim Klimke. And this is not a new book. I've used this several times and read through it. This was published in the year 1999, but I think this is an excellent book. I don't think it's in print anymore. I think this book is probably worth hundreds of dollars now, or more, because it's not. It's kind of a rare book, based on my understanding. There's a book written on the Aramaic churches by, I think, Samuel Hugh Hoffman, I believe. I'll talk about that book later. But this one has a lot of photographs of archaeological remains, which is very significant. So people don't think of this because when we think about Asia, people think about China and India. But a large portion of the Middle East is actually on the continent of Asia. So in the military, some of our wars, they talk about Southwest Asia, which would be Iraq and Syria. So Hans Joachim Klimke is a German scholar, and he's done a lot of work on Gnosticism. But this isn't a book about Gnosticism. This is about Christianity in Asia from the times of the apostles until the year 1500. Of course, you have Nestorian, or the Church of the East's missions in Mongolia and China and India, and a lot of this information is found here. So what I want to talk about in this program is the Jewish roots of the Aramaic churches. And it's very interesting that some of the ways we think of Jewish roots are not necessarily self-evident. And this deals with asceticism. Now, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it looks like this community, which is sometimes identified with the Essenes or a branch of the Essenes, they call themselves the Ahad. And they had a manual discipline, and it was basically a Jewish monastic order. Now, with the Protestant Reformation, we quickly moved away from monasteries and abandoned that in the Protestant tradition. But, like I said, this goes back to pre-Christian time, the time of before Jesus, Jewish monastic communities. And there's actually an Old Testament precedent for that. We look at someone like Jeremiah, who took a vow of celibacy, and you look at Elijah and Elisha. Now, certain prophets like Isaiah were married, they were family men, but some of them were not. And you had these communities, the school of the prophets, I mean, look at Elijah. He's not a family man. He's living out by himself in the wilderness. And John the Baptist himself. So, like I said, as the Protestant churches, we've rejected monasticism. But this is an ancient tradition that derives from Jewish roots of the faith. And I can understand why people in our day and age have rejected that, but it played an important role in the church. And people have a tendency in Protestant circles to heavily criticize the Catholic Church. But these biblical manuscripts that we have, a lot of those were produced and preserved in monastic communities. That's even true today. St. Catherine's Monastery, we have the oldest biblical manuscripts in the world. These manuscripts were created and preserved by these monastic communities. So we can cast aspersions on them all we want and have our conspiracy theories, but they played a very significant role in the history of the church and the preservation of the scriptures. And we don't realize, everything's so easy nowadays with modern technology. To have a Bible, first off, you had to be literate, and most people were not. Secondly, the Bible had to be copied by hand. And take a look at, for instance, Codex Sinaiticus, a parchment, which means that all those pages are a type of leather. It's made out of animal skin. And to produce that Bible, you had to have a flock of sheep. Or just look at papyrus itself, other types of manuscripts, where they had to take the parts of these plants and lay them out and pound them flat. So it was a very labor-intensive thing to have a book. And we just don't understand that now with all of our modern conveniences and privileges. So let's go back to this book. And he talks about the Jewish roots, not just with monasticism, but also earlier in the book he talks about the Jewish roots of the faith in a more general sense. Like this is the basis of Aramaic Christianity. This chapter here, this is found in the book on page 22. So listen to what it says here. The dependence of both Western Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christianity upon the traditions represented by the Pauline, Johannine, and Petrine writings in the New Testament has been heavy indeed. This is talking about how Paul talks about this in Corinthians, how that certain apostles attracted followers, right? So you have these schools of Christian thought. Pauline Christianity, people who are devoted to Paul, which would include Luke, Acts, and the epistles, right? Johannine Christianity, followers of John, and Peterine Christianity, which would be the Gospel of Matthew, which elevates the status of Peter. For instance, the story of Peter walking on water, that's only found in the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew has a heavier focus on Peter, and of course we have 1st and 2nd Peter, and of course a lot of traditions about Peter are also preserved in the book of Acts. So, and there's other schools of Christianity that revolved around other apostles like Thomas. That's another subject I explore elsewhere. So dominant has this been, there's been a long tendency to disregard any tradition as being significant. This has been corrected somewhat of late, not at least through the work of the French historian Jean Danielou and others. What is to be remembered is that which concerns us here are the forms of Jewish or Semitic Christianity found in Asia, and not whether such expressions have validity in the West. For such research has come to the realization that the Jewish Christianity to be found in Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia formed a source of Christianity independent of and of equal importance with Latin and Greek Christianity. Whatever the distinctions might have been that might be made, rightly in terms of aspects of their literary and intellectual traditions, it is very doubtful that such distinctions would have bulked large or even small in the minds of ordinary believers. Along with Rome and Ephesus, Antioch and Edessa, which are Semitic and Eastern in their orientation, are seen to be main centers of the early church. It has become clear that Christianity has been interpreted in several ways according to the genius of the people to whom it was entrusted. If Rome stressed the legal aspects of the new religion, the Greeks developed an ontological interpretation of God and Christ. The Syrians were not very interested in dogmatic strife, at least until Ephraim the Syrian in the 4th century. They conceived their faith rather as a way of life, the way. as it discusses in the book of Acts, where that was the name of what we call the Christian movement. Originally it was called the Way. Jewish Christianity would have been conceived by many Jews as less iconoclastic with respect to the law as the approach of Paul. They were unable to bring it with them into Christianity, rather more than what to them which is a richly meaningful heritage. However little it mattered to Gentile believers. While Jewish Christianity may have initially had a greater interest in orthopraxy rather than doctrinal orthodoxy as interpreted by Paul, that is not to say that they did not have their own theological emphasis and concerns. Danielou saw these Jewish Christians as falling into three major groups. I want to discuss Jewish Christianity briefly. He talks about it here with the different sects. But until the rise of Islam, there's a significant population of Jewish Christian sects in the Holy Land, Jordan, and Syria. And with the rise of Islam, it seems like these communities disappeared. But let's look at Mr. Daniel says about this. Number one, those who accepted Jesus as a prophet or as a Messiah, but not as the Son of God, they used only the Gospel of Matthew, rejected the letters of Paul, and the virginal conception of Jesus, and were called the Ebionites. So some of these sects, but not all of them, were viewed as heretical. Point number two, those at Jerusalem and after, led at first by James, who favored the Jewish ways for themselves, but they were not out to impose these comprehensively upon the Gentile converts. These were called the Nazarenes, as in Acts chapter 24, verse 5, or Nazarenes, if they were East Syrian in location and Aramaic speakers. And number three, those who drawed upon late Judaic thought and forms of the Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots, rather than those of rabbinic Judaism. I want to mention quickly the Odes of Solomon, which seems to be a very ancient Jewish Christian writing in the Aramaic language, and scholars look at it and they see it as someone who'd been part of the Essene community and familiar with the literature from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and probably a part of that group that became a Christian and contributed to the Odes of Solomon. And there seems to be places where it alludes to events that happened in the late 1st century. So it's a very ancient, it's probably the most ancient Christian hymn book. And I think a very compelling case can be made that it dates from the late 1st century. So here we have a hymn book written in Aramaic from the 1st century that's Jewish Christian in origin, and shows the influence of various schools of thought that were contemporary with Jesus and the apostles during the period of Acts and the mid to late 1st century. So I think this is very significant. Also want to mention James, the brother of Jesus. We have a lot of Jewish literature that's preserved, Jewish Christian literature that's preserved by Eusebius. So Eusebius, Eusebius was very interested in the Jewish culture and the Jewish roots of the faith. And he was familiar with these Ebionite and other Jewish Christian communities, and he preserved their writings in his Christian history and other books that he wrote. It says, it was the last of these three groups, which is the one with the lasting influence, and among their concerns are, this is number three, the ones who drew on late Judaic thought forms of the Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots, rather than those of rabbinic Judaism, right? So Judaism as we know it actually is developed after the destruction of the temple. So let's look at the concerns of this latter group. A deep interest in cosmic history from the beginning of all things to their end, in time and across all the dimensions of subterrestrial, terrestrial, and superterrestrial space. Close consequent dependence on revelation, so the mysteries of the created order and its purpose and goal may be perceived through the richness of apocalyptic imagery. A resulting knowledge, the saving knowledge of what the divine action proclaimed in the gospel message has been effected for all men and all creatures for all time. They are divinely appointed means of arriving at this knowledge in the esoteric exegesis of scriptures. He's using the form gnosis, and Klimkit is an expert on Gnosticism, and that's something that studies of students of early Christianity need to be familiar with. The heretical schools of thought and people who were influenced by them. And this is a big struggle of the early church to repress or limit the influence of Gnostic thought. But Gnostic thought has been very influential in the development of Christianity, unfortunately, mostly through the writings of the Gnostic Augustine of Hippo. but that's a different subject. Let's continue here. The whole of human existence was set within the context of God's providential design, prefigured in the Genesis account of creation, in which creation is inaugurated fresh in the Incarnation. Much exegesis was focused on Genesis, in which it was believed there could be discerned the foundations of the doctrine of the Trinity and the establishment of the church. The beginning and end of all things were bound together by Jesus Christ and his cross. Indeed, listen to this, it says, from them, redemption was a cosmic, for the Jewish Christians, redemption was a cosmic matter. The action of the word extended through every region of the spiritual universe, from Sheol to the seventh heaven, and touched every creature. The cross, the instrument of redemption, is not merely the historical and material gibbet used by God as a creative point of history, marvelous though that might be. It is also the double axis of the universe, transcending space by stretching out its arms to unite all nations of men, and by reaching up to its head to join heaven and earth, the angelic hierarchies and the spirits of them that sleep, and transcending time and descending into the as a living being into the lower parts of the earth to preach salvation to the righteous who died in Christ, and by coming in the east in the glorious as the glorious herald of the Savior's final return. It's mentioning here, of course, the descentus, or the harrowing of hell. Related closely, rite of initiation was the preaching of two ways: the angel of light and the prince of darkness, the spirits of virtues and the demons of vices, and the exhortations and steadfast singleness of mind confronted by the baptized, and before admitting him to the sacramental world, where the fire of Christ descended into the waters to destroy the demon, the grains of God's wheat gathered from the mountains to await the coming of the Lord. That's the conclusion of that quote. Throughout all of this, there's a strong theme of continuity between the New Covenant in Christ, the Old Covenant in Abraham, so that all the major features of Christianity are shown to have their roots in the very beginning of all things. From this can be drawn a comprehensive assurance that, despite appearances of contrary, all was secure in God's hands. Alongside this was to stand a distinctive approach to the doctrine of Trinity, in which God was seen to have a form which may be intrinsically visible, and where a female identity was ascribed to the Holy Ghost in ways virtually unknown in Hellenistic Christianity. In early Aramaic Christianity, described as being feminine, but that idea or interpretation was later repressed. A deep interest in asceticism and the virtues of poverty and celibacy, which had parallels with the Essenes, and which were to have long-standing influence in Aramaean Christianity, which clearly antecedates any moves towards monasticism. So the spread of Christianity in the region, we can read about this in the story of St. Jude Thaddeus, where we have some of the 12 apostles, according to traditions, going to the east and first preaching to the Jewish people and preaching the gospel in the Aramaic language. I want to mention this book. He has a very interesting point about how that Aramaic Christianity or Syriac Christianity had developed in its unique way in its Semitic culture. And one of the ways they did this, which is very different, is rather than using the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they used the Diatessaron, a harmony of the Gospels which was put together by the student of St. Justin Martyr. This is Tatian the Assyrian. So when Rabula, one of the Syriac church fathers, repressed the Diatessaron, and he brought the Syriac church, which had developed its own distinct, unique Semitic Christian culture, he repressed that, and he brought Syriac Christianity more in conformity with the Hellenistic or the Greek world. So let's look at asceticism here. I think this author has some very interesting points here. And like I said, this is something that the Protestant world has rejected. I was looking at this book where we have actually started off with, I think this Brad Petrie wrote a book called The Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. So it's like, well, you see the evangelicals and the Protestants becoming more interested in the Jewish roots of the faith. So here this Catholic theologian is embracing that and showing how that a lot of Catholic practices, such as that of the Eucharist, actually are heavily influenced by earlier Jewish culture from which Christianity emerged. And it's interesting to have this Catechism of the Assyrian Church of the East, and the author kind of makes an interesting point. And Protestants do not like ecclesiastical, or evangelicals don't like ecclesiastical garments. It's like, no, why should the pastor be dressed in a robe or any distinctive costume or garments at all? And I said, well, didn't the Lord tell Aaron to wear distinctive garments while he's officiating as the high priest? It's like, well, I guess that's true, right? Something else that that evangelicals don't tend to like is like incense. It's like, well, incense was used in the tabernacle. I mean, God commanded the Jewish people, the Israelites, the children of Israel, to burn incense in the tabernacle and later in the temple. But now we look at these things as, for some reason, is pagan. There's all these things that people think are pagan, which are actually biblical. So let's continue to look at this. This is on page 52 of this book, The Aesthetic Spirit of Syrian Christianity. And I want to mention here, what is this? I forget the name of the author, but a few years ago, he's writing books, History on the Reformation, history on a book on history of the church. And he was mentioning in one of his more recent books that probably what happened, the story of Saint Anthony the Great in Egypt is very, very famous, and he's considered the founder of Christian monasticism. And I went to Egypt 20 years ago, and I visited these monasteries in the Egyptian desert. But it's argued that there's the earlier precedent for these monastic communities actually comes from the Syrian Christian world. It says, doubtless enough has been said already to alert to the reader the particular ascetical tone of Christianity in Syria and Palestine. As one author summed up the situation, early Syriac Christianity is permeated with asceticism. It would seem probable that much of this had its roots in various Jewish groups like the Essenes, but there does not seem to have been something of a propensity of mortification and fasting within the Syrian spirit long before it says, but there does seem to be something of a propensity for the mortification and fasting within the Syrian spirit long before the appearance of Christianity. The same psyche, which was formerly devoted to pre-Christian deities, is now placed at the disposal of the aims of Christian asceticism. So the soil itself within the Syrian countryside was receptive to such seed. So what he's saying is that in the Jewish community we had the Essenes, you had the Yahad community, you had people are engaging in asceticism, like John the Baptist, for instance. But he says that there might have been a propensity that's conducive to the acceptance of this in the Syrian culture already. But you need to also understand that there was already a widespread Jewish diaspora. There's a huge community of Jewish people in Mesopotamia, outside the Holy Land. The seed itself may be seen within Jewish Christianity in Jerusalem, and its first leader, James, the brother of Jesus. According to Hegesippus, as reported by Eusebius of Caesarea, James drank no wine or strong drink, nor did he eat flesh. No razor came upon his head. He did not anoint himself with oil, and he did not use the bath. It's talking about the Roman bath, right, where they'd have communal bathing, which are probably they're baths, but they're cesspools of depravity. So sometimes Christians wouldn't use those, but sometimes it's out of necessity the baths had to be used. But certain Christians decided not to use these public baths for obvious reasons. There are echoes here of the attitude of the Nazarenes. At the very least, James ensured that the determination of the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, verse 29 included provisions concerning types of meats that could be eaten. Out of such a source could emerge amongst those influenced by Jewish Christianity features such as abstention from meat and wine and various sorts of purification. Actually, we do see the idea of mortification of flesh. It is a New Testament theme, as we're going to see here. To the figure and the influence of James could be added that of John the Baptist, whom Tatian in the Diatessaron had on a diet of milk and honey, which was reputedly the food of heaven. So, like I said, there are certain different traditions that are preserved in the Syriac community. But the thing is, if you think about John the Baptist, let's go what the Bible says. He's eating locust and wild honey, right? That's his diet. He's not eating meat, right? Except for, I guess, insect meat. Some people think it's a locust tree that he's just strictly has a vegetarian diet. He's eating the fruit of the locust tree, but seems to be that he's eating locusts, which are kosher, right? And wild honey. He's living off the land, but he's not eating meat. Apparently, I mean, at all. Something significant about John is Jewish. He's descendant of priests, but it also says he remained in the wilderness until his appearance to the world at the Jordan River. So that means he never went to the temple. He never participated in temple rituals. And he didn't eat meat at all. That means however he celebrated Passover was not according to the traditional customs, because he's a strict vegetarian, if you will, or he has I was talking to somebody about pescatarian. It's a modified vegetarianism, but he's not eating the flesh of animals. Also, we need to bear in mind the Dead Sea community, they thought that the temple priesthood was corrupt, so they weren't participating in the temple rituals either. And a lot of the Essenes weren't, but these were fully Jewish, but they weren't aligned with the practices of the high priests and the Jewish elders. Let's continue here. It is clearly more difficult to make an ascetic of Jesus, who seems at times to be accused of being a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. That's Luke chapter 7, verse 34, also 7:31 through 50. In the scriptures, Jesus addresses this issue. John was an ascetic. He's like a hermit. He's living like a monk. Jesus was not. John's out in the wilderness. Jesus goes into towns and cities and engages with people. They're both... Jesus criticized this. He says, look at you people. John comes as an ascetic, and you say, oh, he's crazy. He's demon-possessed. He's a wild man. God's trying to speak to him. Jesus says, I come, I engage with you. I go to your parties. I talk to you. What do they say about me? Well, he's a wine bibber and a glutton, right? It's like you can't win. You try to bring the word of God to the people. They reject it either way, if you're ascetic or if you're engaging with people in meals and in their towns and cities. But Jesus said wisdom will be justified by their children. What is it? He says, like children in the market, we played a song for you, you didn't dance. We played a dirge for you and you didn't weep. So Jesus addressed these two ways to communicate the gospel and the frustration of people rejecting either way. So let's continue here. However, this does not prevent particular use of being made of certain references in the same gospel, as well as passages such as 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 2, Matthew 19:12, also in Luke 6:20 and 21. They were taken to literally exalt actual physical poverty and hunger. Where Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who hunger." In Matthew's gospel, it says, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit." But in Luke's gospel, it's literally those who are poor, those who are hunger. I think Matthew's gospel says those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. But they're blessed in the state. Like I said, the idea of self-mortification, even of virginity, it mentions in the book of Revelations. Well, look at this is Philip's daughters. They were virgins. Look at how the Revelation extols virginity. It says these men were holy men. They were virgins. They hadn't been corrupted by sex. That's what it says. That's what John writes in the book of Revelations. Look, sexuality is a part of life. I'm not trying to repress it. I'm just saying these traditions are scriptural. I mean, that they do seem to be. Jesus talks about those who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God. Look at Paul. Paul says, look, it's better to marry than to burn. I've chosen a celibate life. So there's a place for it scripturally. I mean, this is what the Bible says. Such an approach we bolstered by reference to Luke chapter 6, 24 and 25, along with these with the references in Luke chapter 20, 34 to 36, which favor celibacy as being angelic. And it becomes more explicit in the old Syriac versions. Here we remind of what was said about the emphasis of Tatian and Aphrahat. It's a Syriac church father. Aphrahat. That name is apparently related to the name Farhad. In a similar vein, as far as the Syrian church was concerned, women in the parable of the bridesmaids were virgins and not young girls as in some modern English translations. And the virginity could be applied to men as well as women. James of Jerusalem cited as favoring virginity, and along with the scene influence, this seems to have been a sufficient. This seems to have been sufficient to ease aside Judaism's support for marriage. And I think this is significant. You know, sometimes the Jewish people say, well, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is there you are, people in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, Orthodox to a lesser extent, but, valuing celibacy and saying, well, traditionally Jewish people are more family-oriented. It's like, well, that might be true for Judaism today, or maybe in the Middle Ages. But at the time of Jesus, you had the Jewish monastic communities, which seem to have been an influence on early Christianity. It says, we have already met a number of later key contributors to the stress on asceticism. That the ascetic was regarded in the same respect as the martyr is clear. Even in the time of Ignatius of Antioch, asceticism was an option for devoted Christians. A contemporary of the bishop of Antioch was Saturninus, who was a pupil of the school of Simon Magus and Meander, advocated celibacy and rejection of animal food in his form of Gnosticism. And it talks about Tatian, the person who wrote the Diatessaron or compiled the Diatessaron, and he belonged to a type of monastic community called the Incarites. And that was kind of seen as heretical, but later with Anthony, Christian asceticism rose to a dominant position. Let's continue. I want to skip down and look at some more points here. Now, the doctrine of Addai is the story of St. Jude Thaddeus, or Addai, taking the gospel to the east. And you have a trilogy, if you will. You have the Acts of Thomas, the doctrine of Addai, and the Acts of Mari, which tell the story of Thaddeus, or Thomas and his disciples and the establishment of Aramaic Christianity. And a lot of biblical doctrine and theology, I think that all Christians of whatever denomination agree with, is promoted in these writings. It says, while the doctrine of Addai depicts asceticism, including poverty, as a feature of early Edessaene Christianity, such an approach is obvious in the Acts of Thomas, which is written at Edessa in all likelihood before the year AD 250. And that's something I want to mention briefly, how we have these Acts of the Apostles, the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, which include the Gospel of Thomas, which also have it's the Acts of Thomas, the Acts of John, the Acts of Peter. There's a series of these books named after the 12 apostles, the Acts of Philip. And these books seem to promote not marrying and living a celibate life. And they also elevate the status of women. In all these books, that seems to be a feature of early Christianity. But repressing sexuality, denying sexuality. And I kind of wonder about that. Like I said, that's not something that appeals to the modern Western culture. But in early Christianity, you did have this idea. And I think what's going on is women in the church rejecting, I guess they're seen as sex objects. It's like, well, we're going to deny our sexuality and become valued as children of God. So that's the theme. I kind of wonder, with the heavy focus on the theme of celibacy and the elevation of status of women, if the patronesses of these books might have been women, or if they were written for women, even though very, very few women back then could read or write. But this was part of the early Christian movement, is the elevation of the status of women. And later on, I guess the men of the church kind of tried to repress this early movement from the early church period. But that is a theme of these apocryphal acts, including the Acts of Thomas, where don't get married, live a celibate life. Of course, Paul encouraged people to marry rather than burn with passion and sin. So, and then Paul talks about that, but that shows that this is an early trend, where he talks about these movements which advocated not marrying, and this asceticism became a very big movement in the early church. After the persecution, it's like before Constantine ended the persecution of Christians, you had martyrdoms, or people would give their life for the Lord. They'd be crucified, burned alive, fed to the wild animals, or have executed by gladiators in the arena. And then Constantine ends the persecution, and so people wanted to go and just lay their all, like the martyrs did, just give their lives for God. And a way to do that was to become a monk. And some of the things that these people did, it seems kind of warped and twisted, but they found people they'd stand up all the time. Never, they'd sleep standing, or they would chain themselves. It's all about self-mortification. Of course, it went too extreme. It went so extreme. And when I went to Syria, I went to this place. You had these people who would stand on a column their whole life. They went to the pillar saints. It seems very strange, but they would go to the top of a pillar. And the one in outside of Antioch, St. Simon Stylites, which I was there, I think his pillar was over 30 foot tall. And he went to the top of the pillar, he stayed there. Sometimes he'd preach and teach from it. But this just shows the extreme level of asceticism. It says solitary ascetics were known in Syria from the mid-3rd century, and the Aramaic form of monasticism was obvious from the early, in the 4th century, led by Hilarion. These ascetics included women. As Eusebius reported, they gathered others who could share in the lives of meditation service to others in the form of attaining a vision of God. Some of the more extreme ascetics adopted what would appear later generations somewhat bizarre lifestyles, including those who ate only grass, herbs, and roots, and exposed themselves naked to the bitter cold of winter and the searing heat of summer. Doubtless the most famous of such ascetics were the Stylites, who made their solitary homes atop stone pillars. The most celebrated of these was Simon Stylites, who in 410 to 412 located himself some 50 kilometers east of Antioch, and I went to the ruins of his monastery. And from AD 14 to 59 lived atop a pillar. Theodore reported that Christians who came to consult the Stylite form from as far away as Britain and Spain. So this person became these people became so famous, these pillar saints, that people from around the world would come and listen to them preaching from the top of their pillars, which they didn't come down from. It's very interesting. I think it's kind of strange and warped in a sense, but that was going on in early Christianity. Clearly, he was regarded as someone who continued the office of prophet in the church and also provided the model of holy man in later generations, down to and including the Startsi of Russia. I want to recommend this book about a Startsi called The Way of the Pilgrim. It's a very powerful book about prayer and meditation that was written in Russian by a Startsi. Early in the 5th century, we have references to the sons and daughters of the covenant, whom we have encountered already when reviewing the lives of Ephrahat and Ephraim. They were neither hermits or monks, and yet they were distinct from the common people and belonged in the broad sense to the clergy, virgins dwelling apart from their families, who chose as their protectors ascetics of the opposite sex, traveling with them and even living in the same house with them. Such virgins were known as synaxitoi. The custom of contingents upon living together in the state of so-called spiritual marriage was vigorously opposed by the authorities in the church. So this is not a good idea to have a man and a woman living together. I mean, I can see why the church was scandalized by it, and maybe many of them were living virtuous lives, but I think the temptation is too great. But that's why it was. This is discouraged by the leaders of the church. It's like, that's not really wise or appropriate. Constituting an elite group, this is the sons and daughters of the covenant. They were allowed to have modest possessions and were forbidden to engage in any money-making activity. At baptism, it was required that the heart be circumcised and that a life of continence be embraced. Very much second best in their life was governed precisely by the Ten Commandments. Very much the second best was the life which is governed precisely by the Ten Commandments. What had developed was a form of monasticism quite independent of that which appeared in Egypt under Anthony. But I think this is the precursor. All right, this idea developed in the East before it made its way to Egypt and blossomed, if you will, into what we know as monasticism. Equally second best in the eyes of this group were forms of synagogic or communal monasticism, but these grew in popularity along with the model established by Saint Basil the Great in the 6th century Such a growth was against the condemnation of such as Isaac of Antioch, who lived around 8500, who regarded such Cenobites as monks who turned into merchants. So we have these saints that, like Benedict, that invented, monasticism became so popular that, these rules of the monastery are made by St. Benedict and others. The ascetic's role was not entirely one of self-concern. Simon Stylites, as well as being the spiritual mentor of many, was regarded virtually as the patron and protector of Antioch. I wish I made it to Antioch. I wasn't able to. His death. Antioch is very important. The Gentile Christianity originated in Antioch, according to the book of Acts, and it was an important center of early Christianity for some time. His death, so soon after a particular destruction. Let me continue here. His death so soon after a particular destructive earthquake at Antioch was seen as a double penalty on the inhabitants of the city. The ascetics took up the causes of social justice on behalf of the homeless, the needy, the poor, and powerless. I think that we have extremism now with the left or the Marxist, and you got these despicable, wicked people who are derisively called social justice warriors. But we should have concern about those who are suffering and injustices. But these people, they don't really believe in social justice, and it's not a good movement. But just because people are extremists doesn't mean that they have the wrong perspective. But we should be concerned about justice and the poor, right? So it's not wrong to advocate for the cause of right and to help the poor. But these social justice warriors have lost their way. But hopefully we can find common ground and a way to help people. That's not something we're against. We're just against their ill-advised approach to matters. Seeing themselves as outcasts, they campaigned for the suppressed and the powerless. In this, they undertook roles quite different from those of the elite among the Manichaeans, even to the point of praying for the barren women and the restitution of marriages facing disruption despite their own preferences for celibacy. It appears that they opposed the institution of slavery as a denial of human dignity, and they're ready to offer refuge, food, clothing, and consolation to those in need. And all asceticism was joined to concern for others in their attempts to imitate Christ and be joined to Him. And that reminds us that also reminds us of St. Francis of Assisi, right? He became a kind of a monk, but what was his objective? To pattern his life after Jesus Christ, to focus on the gospel message, but also to have a renewed concern for the poor and suffering of those who are diseased and marginalized by society. I want to mention briefly this author on church history, a man who wrote on the Reformation, Diarmaid MacCulloch. And I enjoyed his book, and he also deals with Syrian asceticism and some of his other books. He wrote a book called Christianity the First 3,000 Years, which is helpful, and some other books as well dealing on the rise of monasticism. So we have Christianity the First 3,000 Years, the Reformation and History, and Silence, a Christian History. I think that's the one I'm talking about, where he talks about Syrian asceticism. Now, I was reading his books, and I thought it was very strange how he touches on, the phenomenon of homosexuality in church history. And it turns out, not surprisingly, that he himself is a homosexual. But his books do have a lot of important information in them, especially Silence, Reformation, and Christianity the First 3,000 Years. It's important for us to, people need to be doing the research and putting this information out there. It's him doing it and others, but we need to be learning about church history, where the church has gone before as we move into the future. And we need to get back to the Jewish roots of the faith as well for spiritual renewal, and get back to the apostles and their teachings, so that we can impact the whole world with the gospel. And it's very important we look at these, like this book, which is strongly recommended, where you have Christians in Asia before 1500, and what do we have? We have significant Christian communities in India, China, Mongolia, and of course the Middle East And a lot of people aren't aware that they know Jesus spoke Aramaic, but even today that there's an important group of Christian churches that still speak Aramaic and still use a form of Aramaic very close to what Jesus did in their church services. And I think as we move forward, we need to reconnect with the Semitic roots and with the Aramaic origins of faith and with the activity of the apostles as well. And there are certain things I think we can glean that are helpful. Maybe not asceticism in this day and age. And like I said, this is very interesting where you have these sons and daughters of the covenant. Maybe a lot of these people were virtuous, but some of the bishops were concerned about their activities. And there has been, I think, we see this in writings of Shakespeare, like in Hamlet, to the nunnery with you. If their women were problems, maybe becoming too sexual or scandalous, they would punish women sometimes back in those days. They embarrassed people by sending them to convents. And of course, sometimes that didn't help anything. I think I need to track this down, but there's this book written about the secret archives of the Vatican. And what had happened is you had this woman who was sexually deviant, whose family tried to get rid of her by putting her against her will into a monastery. And what was she doing? She was engaging in perversion and corrupting this convent, seducing priests and nuns. And the Vatican had to do an investigation and I guess resolve this issue, but they didn't want to scandalize the church. So this is something that happened in the Middle Ages. That was, of course, that's why it's part of the secret library, the Vatican. So, but just because certain things like that happen, doesn't mean that most. For instance, you see these scandals in the Catholic Church, but I've known a lot of Catholic priests who are good, virtuous people. And shouldn't we be expected to live a holy life? People fail, people are sinful, but I think that we should extol these virtues. But like Paul said, Paul chose to live a celibate life, but he says, for others, it's perhaps better to marry than to burn. And we need to realize that God created us, and he created us as sexual people, and that's just an expression of our humanity. And we're commanded in the scriptures to be fruitful and multiply. And these people went to the monastic communities, and I think they did and have contributed significantly to the growth of the God and spread of the gospel. But a lot of Christian growth is also by people having families, having large families, and raising these children up with knowledge of the scriptures and raising them unto salvation, ushering them into God's kingdom by their upbringing. So I think this is very important, and I'm going to explore these issues in upcoming lectures. Thank you, and God bless you.
Research, rescue, and restore. Help Voice of the Word and Aramaic Christian Ministries mission research the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times of the Bible. Rescue persecuted Assyrian Christians in the Middle East and restore Christianity to its original Semitic roots. For Stephen Missick's books, online giving, and other resources from Aramaic Christian Ministries, visit www.stephenmissick.com. Join us next time on Voice of the Word as we research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots.